Hey guys, so we're gonna get started with the end of Unit 3 material and the rest of Exam 1 will be wrapping up. So this video shouldn't be too long, there is not a whole lot to cover. So we just talked about the blood supply to the CNS, the brain and the spinal cord. Now we're talking about the blood drainage from the CNS. So think venous system. I'm on page 45, mid to bottom of the page. So the first note written under there, venules and veins of the CNS do not follow back the same course the arteries and arterioles followed inward. So a lot of the stuff you learn in gross anatomy, a lot of the extremity veins, arteries, they all kind of run together. That's not the case in the CNS. And once you see, so we just looked at the circle of Willis and how that looks, what that structure looks like. We're going to talk about these sinuses that drain the blood away. And when you see the image for that, it's on 46, page 46. If you want to take a look at that, you can tell it follows a completely different pattern. So the big thing to know, venules and veins do not follow the same course as arteries do, like you might see in the rest of the body. I've got written up on the slide there. So DVS is going to be dural venous sinus. I'm not going to keep typing it out. They receive blood from the scalp via emissary veins and from the bone via diploic veins. So make sure you know the specifics of these. Simple, silly way I remember this was scalp has an S in it. So scalp uses emissary veins to drain to the dural venous sinus. And then bone and diploic, if you just flip the B, it's a D, so that's what helped me remember. Bone drains via diploic veins. And on flipping through my book, image we've already talked about, on page 34, the meningeal layers and spaces figures, it shows the dural venous sinus it's showing is the superior sagittal dural venous sinus, which we're about to talk about. And then you can see there it shows diploic versus emissary veins. So they're draining blood from the bone in the scalp to superior sagittal dural venous sinus in that figure. And then we have number 5 says the volt drainage is into the right or left internal jugular veins at the jugular foramina. So that's the end game. So we're going to talk about all these dural venous sinuses throughout the cranial vault. Where they all eventually end up leaving is the internal jugular vein. So make sure you know that. So the difference between the blood supply and the blood drainage is the drainage leaves through these internal jugular veins. And if you can remember when we talked about blood supply to the brain, we said most of the supply came from the internal carotid arteries. So those are the differences there. So again, just look out, is he asking for where the supply is coming from or where it's going to, where it's draining to? Next we have the inferior sagittal DVS. So we said the superior one runs along the attached margin of the falx cerebri, and I highlighted that and bolded that in the last slide. Now with the inferior sagittal dural venous sinus, it runs along the posterior 2/3 of the falx cerebri, which is considered the unattached or free margin. So looking at the diagram, it's the one right below or inferior to the superior sagittal dural venous sinus that I have in kind of a dark purple. So that's the one that goes along the unattached margin. So know that, be able to differentiate. That sounds like a good test question to make sure you know which one goes with which. And then we have in the book that the inferior sagittal, along with the great cerebral vein of Galen, empty blood into the straight dural venous sinus. So you have to know that, and just reading the sentence in the book, you're like, okay, how am I going to remember this? But if you look at the diagram, you can see it's spelled out right in front of you. You've got the inferior sagittal dural venous sinus in purple, and then you have the great cerebral vein, that little one in light blue. Those go right into the straight dural venous sinus. That's in orange there. So again, I know I keep saying it, but looking at the diagram, it's just makes it a lot easier to remember these things because you can picture it. So those two run into the straight or rectus dural venous sinus. I'm talking too fast here. Which leads me to that one. So In your book, it says the rectus dural venous sinus is at the junction of the falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, and falx cerebelli. So now we're comparing it to the dural falces again, right? So looking at it, it's the orange one that the two we just talked about are going to drain into. And if you kind of picture the dural falces diagram and overlay that on this diagram, it's right. The statement makes sense. It's at the junction of the three dural falces. So the next bullet says that the straight or rectus dural venous sinus runs in a posterior inferior direction to the confluence of sinuses. So the confluence is what I circled in green there. And going along with the statement, looking at the diagram, it's like, well, it looks slanted so that it would run in a posterior inferior direction. So that makes sense. When I think about the dural venous sinuses from the confluence up, I just picture them all going, if you kind of put your fingers at the front of the forehead of this person in the diagram, where the superior sagittal dural venous sinus starts, and run your fingers back and down, that's kind of the flow of how it goes. So everything is going back to the confluence. So then it says the straight dural venous sinus drains into the left transverse dural venous sinus. This is different from the superior sagittal dural venous sinus we just talked about, because we said that one goes right. So that was the exception. The straight is going to go left, and the transverse dural venous sinuses, we haven't got there yet, but they're the ones in green there. So that's when they become bilateral. So superior sagittal dural venous sinus goes right, straight is going left. Now, the inferior sagittal and great cerebral vein of Galen, those drain into the straight dural venous sinus. So be careful when you're taking the exam, because they eventually go left. They have to drain into the straight dural venous sinus first, and then the straight goes left. So if he asks you a question on where does the inferior sagittal dural venous sinus drain, and he has left transverse dural venous sinus as an answer, eventually it goes left, but pick the more specific answer, which would be the straight or rectus dural venous sinus. Next, we have the occipital dural venous sinus. So I am on page 47 still at the bottom. So this one on the image above is the light purple one. Reading through the book, it says it runs along the attached margin of the falx cerebelli into the confluence of sinuses. So again, overlaying that image we went over of the dural falx, you can imagine it sits right where that falx cerebelli would be. It looks just like the one that we labeled for the falx cerebelli. So taking that a step further, then, if he asked a question saying which, he could connect it to the posterior cerebellar notch. I hope that makes sense, because the falx cerebelli sits in the posterior cerebellar notch, right? So again, make sure you're connecting these things, and look out for which term he's looking for in the answer. So once the falx cerebelli gets to the confluence of sinuses, that one is also going to go left. Like I mentioned before, the superior sagittal dural venous sinus goes right, and the other ones go left. So occipital and straight go left. Next, we have the occipital dural venous sinus. So I am on page 47 still at the bottom. So this one on the image above is the light purple one. Reading through the book, it says it runs along the attached margin of the falx cerebelli into the confluence of sinuses. So again, overlaying that image we went over of the dural falx, you can imagine it sits right where that falx cerebelli would be. It looks just like the one that we labeled for the falx cerebelli. So taking that a step further, then, if he asked a question saying which, he could connect it to the posterior cerebellar notch. I hope that makes sense, because the falx cerebelli sits in the posterior cerebellar notch, right? So again, make sure you're connecting these things, and look out for which term he's looking for in the answer. So once the falx cerebelli gets to the confluence of sinuses, that one is also going to go left. Like I mentioned before, the superior sagittal dural venous sinus goes right, and the other ones go left. So occipital and straight go left. Next, I'm just putting the whole diagram up on here. We're going to talk about transverse dural venous sinuses. So these are the ones I've already mentioned. They're bilateral. Looking at the green on this is where everything becomes bilateral with the transverse dural venous sinuses. You'll notice looking at the right side of the diagram, everything after that, there's two of each. So the transverse dural venous sinuses run along the fixed occipital bone margins of the tentorium cerebelli. So this is another one that's related to a dural falx. Tentorium cerebelli was the one that was the only one that was bilateral of the dural falces, the one that forms a tent over the cerebellum, right? So it should make sense if you picture it that can run right through there. And then again, if I ask you to relate that to a fissure, which one do you think it would be? So how I would say this when I'm studying is the transverse dural venous sinus sits along the tentorium cerebelli, which sits in the transverse or horizontal fissure. And that would be, let me say it one more time, the transverse or horizontal cerebral fissure. Next, we've got the sigmoid dural venous sinuses, mid-page 48. These are also bilateral because everything's bilateral once we leave the confluence. Big thing with this is realize that these are the ones that are going to be continuous with the internal jugular vein. And that should ring a bell because we talked about at the beginning of this section that internal jugular veins are the end game for this drainage system. So looking up on the diagram, I have the sigmoid sinus is in like a, I don't know, is that like a magenta pink? Like a dark pink. So that's what the green, the transverse dural venous sinus runs into that. And then the sigmoid continues onto the internal jugular vein, which I don't have colored on this diagram. It becomes the internal jugular vein. It runs right into it once it passes through the jugular foramina that we mentioned early on in this section. Then we have our superior petrosal and inferior petrosal dural venous sinuses. The big thing to know so they're both small and bilateral sinuses. Big thing to know with the superior petrosal dural venous sinus, and that's the one that is in like the lighter pink that I have. I have the notes written on the very right side of this diagram. This is where our middle ear veins drain. So this is important because ear infections are pretty common, right? So if our middle ear veins drain here, it's a route for infection to spread. So make sure you know that. And then you can see there's two arrows. So if you're looking on the diagram, the pink is the superior petrosal. There's an arrow going both ways for that. And then for the inferior, there's only an arrow going down towards the sigmoid dural venous sinus. So what that means is that the superior petrosal dural venous sinus, the pressure is so low there that the blood can flow either way, whereas the inferior petrosal dural venous sinus is only going to flow down to that sigmoid. So both of those run into the sigmoid dural venous sinus. And then one more point with the inferior petrosal dural venous sinus is that it carries blood along the petrooccipital suture to the sigmoid DVS. Be aware of that. You probably won't see that word or be familiar with the structure until you get to spinal. So I'm not going to go explaining it. Just make sure that you know that for the exam. And then lastly, I don't have it colored in on my diagram, but if you look at the one on the right, actually you can see it on the left too, we have the cavernous sinus. So that's where blood is being taken from with the superior and inferior petrosal dural venous sinuses. And this cavernous sinus, if you picture the dural falx diagram placed over the one on the right, that looks like it would be right where the diaphragma sella would be, right? So that's the one you want to associate with this area here. And last section in Unit 3 is the brain ventricles and CSF production and flow. So we're almost there. Looking at page 50, a couple big points I want to make. I'm looking at, pretty much you want to know this whole page, but I want to emphasize letter C, the mature central canal of the spinal cord is lined by ependymal cells but does not produce true CSF. So the ependymal cells aren't producing anything here. So make sure you're aware of that. And we're going to talk about which ventricles do produce true CSF. So if that question comes up on your exam, you should know it from reading this part, but you can kind of think your way through it because we'll talk about where true CSF is produced. Next, I'm looking at E. We talked about this already. CSF is produced in the ependymal cells. Collectively, we said, if you can remember from the histology section, collectively the ependymal cells are called choroid plexuses. So that is where CSF is being produced. And then just to note that we're going to talk about all of this in depth, but the CSF flows into the subarachnoid space via the fourth ventricle. So we're going to be relating a lot of this to the fourth ventricle. If you can remember when we talked about the cisterns and how they were connected to the fourth ventricle, if you can remember, we talked about the cisterna magna with the median foramina magendi that had an opening, and then we had the lateral foramina of Luschka that had the opening into the pontine cistern. So those are connections to the fourth ventricle that CSF can use to get into the subarachnoid space. Last point on this page I want to make is that just be aware that the ventricles, they're not CNS accessory structures, but we present them in this section because of their contributions to the subarachnoid space, and the subarachnoid spaces are accessory. So just be aware of that. Turning to page 51, so I didn't put all of the information from the page on here. I'm going to go over all of it, and it's all up on this diagram here. So starting with the right and left lateral ventricles, so they're bilateral. These are the only ventricles that are bilateral. So definitely be aware of that, and they're the largest. And looking at this diagram here, if you see the lateral ventricle is the big one that has all of these parts that we're about to go through. The third ventricle is the pink one, and the fourth ventricle is the light blue one there. So I didn't color in the lateral ventricle, but there's two of them. They're connected anteriorly by a structure called the septum pellucidum. So be aware of that. Where some students kind of mix it up is that there's a structure that connects the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. That's called the interventricular foramina of Monroe. So that structure connects lateral ventricle with third ventricle. What connects two of the same, the right and left lateral ventricles, is the septum pellucidum. So don't get those confused. Make sure you know the 5 basic parts of the lateral ventricles. So looking at on this diagram, the one on the top left is a side view, whereas the one on the bottom is kind of looking from top down. So you can see the 2 lateral ventricles, and the septum pellucidum actually is the brown one that I have there labeled. Back to the side view. So I'm going to start inferiorly on the lateral ventricle. We have an inferior horn, and then we have an atrium, also known as a collateral trigone. Know both of those terms. And then we have a posterior horn, a body that runs into the anterior horn. So the 3 horns we have are inferior, posterior, and anterior. So be aware of all of those parts. And then number F, I didn't type it out, but I put it on the slide, F. Make sure you know this. Read through this a couple times and go along with it on the diagram, and that'll help you visualize it so you can work through this answer a little bit better. So you want to know the choroid plexus's kind of course through these ventricles. So I'm going to start in the book. I'm going to read it and go back to the diagram. It says it's located along the roof of the inferior horn, so the top of the inferior horn. If you know it starts there, then we're going to go through up to the atrium, and then it goes along the floor of the body. It wouldn't make sense for it to jump up and be on the roof of the body, so we're going to stay at the same course we're taking. So roof of inferior horn through the atrium to the floor of the body, and then it's going to go through the interventricular foramen of Monro to the roof of the third ventricle. So it goes roof of inferior, floor of body, roof of third ventricle. And I left out the atrium there just so you would get it goes from the roof to the floor to the roof. So make sure you know that course. Next we have the third ventricle. So looking in the book, 3b says it receives CSF from the lateral ventricles via the interventricular foramen of Monro. We just mentioned that when we talked about the course of the choroid plexus. And then it also produces CSF itself because, like we just talked about in the course of the choroid plexus is present on the roof of the third ventricle. So starting from the top, the lateral ventricle is the most superior of the ventricles, and then it goes third, then fourth. So I picture it, and if you look at the diagram of the cisterns I talked about, I said I really liked it for visualizing everything. It has the ventricles on there, and you can see the laterals at the top, then the third, and then the cerebral aqueduct connects the third and the fourth. So the lateral ventricle doesn't receive any CSF because it's the start of everything. So it's making CSF only and then passing it along. The third ventricle in the middle is receiving from the lateral ventricles above it, and then it's also making it. So make sure you're aware of that. It receives it and it makes it. There's a note 3c that says inferiorly, the third ventricle is continuous with the cerebral aqueduct. So be aware of that. If you know the cerebral aqueduct connects the two numbered ventricles, 3 and 4, that should be pretty easy for you. Last of the ventricles is the fourth ventricle. So when we talked about the course of the choroid plexus, we didn't mention it extending into the fourth ventricle, right? So we said the third ventricle receives and makes its own CSF. The fourth ventricle is only receiving CSF. It's not making it. So on the next page, 52, we talk about the 5 openings into or out of this ventricle. There's only one opening into the fourth, and that's the cerebral aqueduct. And that seems pretty self-explanatory, knowing the cerebral aqueduct connects the third and the fourth ventricles. So that's the one opening into it. And then there's 4 leaving. These we already talked about with the cisterns. The only one we didn't mention is the central canal. So if you go back to that diagram of the cisterns, you can see the fourth ventricle runs right into the central canal. So it's connected to it. So that's one opening leaving. And I have these listed on the bottom of this diagram too. The central canal is connected to the fourth ventricle, so that's one leaving. And then we talked about how the cisterna magna was connected to the fourth ventricle via the median foramen of Magendie. And then we had our 2 lateral foramina of Luschka that connect the fourth ventricle to the pontine nuclei, right? So those are the 4 leaving. Don't forget that the lateral foramina of Luschka is 2 of them. So there's 2 of those, 1 foramen of Magendie, 1 to the central canal. That makes the 4 leaving, and then the 1 coming in is the cerebral aqueduct. So that's all listed on this diagram here. Everything is labeled. Next, we'll move on to CSF. I think that's the last of the Unit 1 material. Still on page 52, we are looking at cerebrospinal fluid now, or CSF. So know the characteristics that I put up there. It first forms during 5th to 6th month of fetal development. Know that time period, the 5th to 6th month, And then it's mostly water, it's clear and colorless. So know those characteristics of it. And then jumping down to 7, to kind of go along with that, it says that CSF is quite different from blood plasma. So instead, it's closer in similarity to interstitial fluid. So know that. How I remembered it easily for the exam is that the abbreviation for interstitial fluid is ISF. So I was like, CSF, ISF, they're almost the same abbreviations. So that was easy to remember. And then on the next page, 53, it goes through some functions. So know the functions. It lists, or it's a fill in the blank. So you should have filled in shock absorber, buoyancy, and then others. And then Dr. Torgard went through a few others. So the big ones I would know are shock absorber and buoyancy. Moving to the middle of the page, I don't have it up on my slide, but there's a question that lists how does CSF compare to the following estimates. I'm not going to read through those numbers, but make sure you do know them. And then is CSF actively overturned each day? Definitely know this. The answer is yes. So CSF is something that we are constantly making. So the numbers that go along with that, you're going to want to know as well. We make 500 milliliters per day, and it's overturned 4 to 5 times a day. So be familiar with those numbers. The bottom of the page just goes over production of CSF. You should be familiar with choroid plexuses. 78% is secreted by choroid plexuses. I would just be aware of the big picture there that the active process is the choroid plexus secreting CSF. I'm going to turn the page. Last page. So only a couple things I really want to hit on this page that you already have gone through if you've gone through all these videos. Where is most CSF returned to the blood plasma? The answer to that is arachnoid villi, right? We discussed that with how they are most prominent in the superior sagittal dural venous sinus, and they use CSF from the subarachnoid space, and then it drains through the dural venous sinus. Next, if you look at G, it says CSF obstruction. I would be aware of the term we already talked about, ependymoma with histology. We said those were the most restrictive tumors of the CNS. So that's a little review on those terms. Next, I'm going to go over the whole course of CSF production, and hopefully that'll kind of tie everything we've talked about in together. So back to this diagram, I wrote it all up at the top, but I'm going to kind of talk through it. If you look at page 54, there's a figure that says circulation pattern of CSF, so I'm going to refer to that too. But CSF production starts in the ependymal cells, so collectively those are called the choroid plexus, right? That's going to start in the lateral ventricles. That's the very top of everything, where the production begins. And then from there, they go down through the interventricular foramina of Monroe into the third ventricle. The third ventricle receives through that opening from the lateral ventricles, and it also makes its own CSF. And then it travels from the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, it's going to exit into the subarachnoid space. It leaves through those 4 openings out, the foramen of Magendie, the lateral foramina of Luschka, and the central canal. So that's where it's exiting from. Now it's in the subarachnoid space, and if you look at that diagram on page 54, it's going to circulate throughout the CNS like that. Its function, we just talked about buoyancy, shock absorber, other. And then the arachnoid villi pull it out from the subarachnoid space into the dural venous sinuses, and now it's mixed with the blood in the dural venous sinus system that's going to drain. So that's how the production and flow of CSF goes, and that's all I have for the rest of Exam 1 material. So good luck. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try to keep an eye on my messages and email so I can get back to you guys right away.